35,000 years old. So I just want to start by saying there is nothing like that in Ireland, because 35,000 years ago, the ice was over the top of Slieve Foy. For much of the ice age, which lasted about 100,000 years, the ice was a kilometer thick, and no form of life survives that. Now, that ice disappeared about 14,000 years ago. And as the ice melted, of course, the sea levels rose. And at some point, people arrived into Ireland, somewhere about 8,000, 8,500 BC. So 10,000 years ago almost. Now, people are disputing whether they walked from Scotland or sailed a boat. The argument is tending towards sailed a boat, that when the first humans arrived, it was no longer possible. There was no land bridge from Scotland. But they arrived about, 9,000 years ago. And the first settlement that we can trace of these Paleolithic people, these hunter-gatherers, is a place called Mount Sandal near Coleraine at the mouth of the Bann. So that's how long people have been in Ireland at all. Now, they spread over the country from that northeast corner. The first trace we have of humans in Omeath is not that much later, 1,000 or so years later, and it's from Narrowwater. When in 2015, when there was talk of the Narrowwater Bridge, they sent the archaeologists in to study the site, and they found clear evidence of a Paleolithic hunter-gatherers site from about 6,000 or earlier BC. So there have been people around Omeath for possibly 8,000, 9,000 years. Then the first farmers came. They were what we call the Neolithic. They came about 4,500 BC, and they're the people who built the likes of the cairns on the mountain. There's scraping implements, by the way, and boring implements also found at Narrowwater. The Neolithic people, the farmers, they also hunted deer that they introduced into Ireland. And the archaeologists have found what they call a Fulloch Fia, which is a place for cooking large numbers of deer carcasses. And this one was found on Cornamuckla Mountain, directly in front of Kieran Phillips's house. And it's possible for you to go up there and find that. In fact, there are over 30 prehistoric sites in and around the 10 townlands of Omeath. You can see there, that's from the Louth Archaeological Survey. Now, almost all of them are simple ring forts like the one on the right. These could be anything from 1,000 to 4,000 years old. They were simple ditches, circular ditches that bushes were planted on top of, and it was a place to keep your animals safe at night from animal thieves, whether with 4 legs like wolves or 2 legs like rustlers, which were an even bigger problem. The handiest place to see a good ring fort is up in the field beside Anne McKeown's house in Demulla, where there's a very fine one beside the sheds there with a nice ring of trees round it. Ring forts like this are typically called a lis, as in the name Lisley, or a rath, as in Rathfriland, or a dun, as in Dundalgan, and so on. But they all mean the same thing. They are not military fortifications. They are merely to protect farmsteads of various kinds. So the Neolithic farmers came 6,000 years ago, and these ridges are at Doolargy, up in the Cooley Mountains. And a lot of people thought at first these were famine, lazy beds from the famine times. The problem with that theory is that there's turf on top of some of these ridges, And in fact, these are Neolithic cornfields up around the dune and above the Jameson's house. They're Neolithic cornfields, you know, which the Neolithic farmers planted their grain, their corn, their wheat, their oats, their rye in this case. They planted them on raised beds because they were going to cut them with sickles, and the sickles were a stick with flint teeth set into a split in the stick. So it would have the owl back if you had it on raised beds. It was the Neolithic farmers who built the cairns, who built Newgrange, who built the cairn on top of Slievegallion, and who built Narrowwater here, the burial chambers. We have two fairly magnificent cairns, Claremont Cairn beside the TV mast, and Narrowwater not so far from it. Now, the earliest inhabitants that we know about are from, this is what the annals, the records kept in later years by monks tell us about early Ireland. And this man, Father Lawrence Murray, Lurcan O'Murray, wrote a little history of Omeath when he was in charge of the Irish College in about 1920. And this little Omeath history, I have it available if anybody wants it online. I have scanned it in, transcribed it, and so on. And according to him, the old name for Carlingford Lough was Cún Anya, and the earliest known inhabitants were the Anyacha. And the Anyacha were part of the people of Ulster, the people of Conor MacNessa and the Clan Rory, as it was known. And as the story of the Tombo Culnia tells us, there was gradual invasions from the south and the west, and eventually the Ulster kingdom collapsed in about the year 300 when it was invaded by the three sons of Culla. And the three sons of Culla, one of their tribes in their clan was called the Omeath. And they were the descendants of Murroch May or Murroch the Fat. So that's where we get it from. They had three territories, according to the annals. They had Omeath Tira in Monaghan, near Holland. They had Omeath Macha, somewhere near Cady. And from about the year 1000, they had Omeath Mara, which is our Omeath, and the one by the sea. And we just want to kill off one myth, first of all, that Lurcan O'Murray doesn't deal with very well, doesn't make quite clear. There's a legend that the people of Omeath ate St. Patrick's goat. Well, it was the people of Omeath Tara, the Monaghan savages, that did that. It was not our people. The story is, anyhow, they denied they ate the goat, but then the goat started bleating out of their stomachs when St. Patrick tried to bless them. So anyhow, it was them savages up in Monaghan that did that, and not us. So the next big item in our timeline is the Vikings. And here they are in a boat. And the first thing I want you to look at closely in that nice picture of the Vikings is there's none of them with any horns. Now, there are about over 100 depictions of the Vikings, drawings, sketches like this one from England, from Lindisfarne, which was the first place the Vikings attacked. The Vikings came to Ireland in the year 795. And we have lots of, the National Library has lots of these drawings and hundreds of accounts and descriptions of the Vikings, and there isn't a mention of horns on the helmets. In fact, horns on the helmets began in Victorian times when they were staging Wagner operas, which involved the Vikings. I'll be coming back to that later on. So there's a nice view from the flagstaff. So why did they call it the flagstaff? Well, the trick with the flagstaff is not to look southeast down the loch, but first of all, look directly west towards Slievegallion. And on a clear day, you can see the white statue of Saint Munina on the mountainside at Slitgullion. And just below that, there was the monastery, the Killeavy Monastery. And it was first raided, probably in the 820s. And they got kind of sick of that. So what they started doing, because the Vikings only raided in those early years in the spring and summer, they started putting a sentry up on a high hill in Fadden on St. Patrick's Day. And his job, probably he, was to look out for sails in the loch. And if he saw sails in the loch, he ran a warning flag up on a great pole that was on top of the hill, which could be seen from the monastery. So the monks had time to lift all their precious objects and clear away up the mountain somewhere and hide in time before the Vikings got there. Just so we understand the Vikings a bit better, they weren't anti-religious. They were probably more tolerant than the Irish in matters of religion. But the fact is that Ireland had no towns. And the only buildings, substantial buildings in the country were, in fact, monasteries. And the monks did not build the round towers to protect themselves from Vikings. They built them to protect themselves to some extent from each other. But the important point is the Vikings weren't the only ones raiding the monasteries. The monasteries were places of safekeeping for valuables for the whole community. If you had movable wealth, you stored it in the monastery under the blessing of God and St. Patrick and the monks, and you hoped it would be safe. That's why the Vikings were raiding the monasteries. It wasn't because of the well-known atheism in particular. In 841, they wiped out our own little monastery down in the Ferry Wood, and they according to an account found in Brussels in the 1830s and written sometime in Louvain in the 1640s by a monk called Eamon McCanna. According to that, the Vikings killed over 300 monks who were daily singing the praises of Jesus their Lord in this monastery in the Ferry Wood. Now, this is complete rubbish and nonsense and a piece of typical Christian anti-Viking propaganda. There was no way there was 300 monks down there. There wouldn't have been that many in Killeavy itself. Ireland did not have those great big monasteries like was on the continent. Ireland had small hermitage monasteries. So what was the monks doing in the Ferry Wood? Well, I think that they may have been running a little church and hostel for pilgrims. And where were the pilgrims going? The pilgrims were coming from all over Ireland through the Gap of the North, and they were heading down to the Ferry Wood to take the ferry across to walk to the next monastery in Burren, from there to the next monastery at Kilcoo, and from there they were only one day's walk to Downpatrick and the grave of St. Patrick. The pilgrimages to St. Patrick's grave were absolutely massive in Ireland until they were disrupted by the Viking raids. So here's a round tower. Did the monks build this? No. Did the Vikings cause them to build it? Absolutely not. No, the trick here is to notice there's a solar panel on this round tower. The only one I know of with a solar panel. And it, in fact, was built by the Newry Navigation Company in 1888. And those of you who might go sailing in odd time will know that there's another smaller tower out in the water. And the trick is to line the two towers up if you want to sail safely in the navigation channel, in the dredge channel towards Newry. The Newry Navigation used to be responsible for keeping the lamps lit before there was solar panels, for keeping the lamps lit on this tower and on all the navigation buoys, which you can see at night blinking now in the water around up to Victoria Loch. And the oil and all the equipment on the boat for servicing all those buoys was kept in this little red shed on what they call the Luby. The Luby is the bank running out to the red shed from the Ferry Wood at Narrowwater. Now, the bank is modern. If you look at the map on the right-hand side from 1834, it'll say a bank in progress. But there was an island called Nuns Island out where the red shed can be seen today. And substantial human remains were found on that island when the Newry navigation was putting the shed in there in probably about the 1840s, around famine times. So there was some sort of graveyard out on the island, possibly used by the monks from the Ferry Wood. Just come back to the Ferry Wood for a moment. Where those bluebells are, after the Vikings destroyed the monastery, there's no trace of it now. That site was used as a killeen into modern times for over 1,000 years. It was used as a killeen or a burial place for unbaptized children. And the story goes that according to Lorcan and Murray, as the population pressure increased, the population grew very sharply before the famine. And the local farmers kept creeping into the woods to those little clearings and planting lazy beds of spuds there. And there was one Carnamuckler family that did that, but they quit doing it when they turned out the pot of spuds and drained them one day and found a few small human bones scattering out from among the boiled spuds. So that was the end of that. Now, who's this? Well, according to Lorcan and Murray, the whole Tristan and Isolde opera, Wagner opera from the 1860s, is in fact based upon an Omeath story. This is the story about the King of Cornwall hearing of this beautiful woman, and he wants to make her his wife, and he sends one of his soldiers over to bring her over from Ireland to Cornwall, but they drink a magic potion, fall in love, blah, blah, you know, the usual sort of stuff. But according to Lorcan and Murray, it's originally an Irish Viking story, and the Viking concerned was called Gorm, and he was leader of the Omeath Vikings about the year 900. You can take that for what it's worth, but it is possible that that whole opera has an Omeath origin. And the Vikings, there were both Danes and Norwegians here, and they had a habit of fighting with each other. And in the year 1928, they had a major battle between themselves, which did not go well. And a few years later, they raided Killeavy Monastery again, and they were coming back over the Cadger's Pad, the Anaverna Pass, when they met a large combined Irish force that under Murchadh MacNeill, the Tánaiste of the High King, and he defeated the Vikings, the annals say, with great slaughter. And after that, the foreigners of Lindoachill, which is what they called Annagassan, and Cuan Anya, Carlingford, they packed up and left Ireland. And that's probably the point at which the Omeath people came here. Next up is the Normans. They arrived in 1170, and Carlingford Castle was built about 1205, 1210. It's not too sure if King John ever actually stayed in the castle. He did seize it for a while, but maybe not personally. What we do know about King John, though, is that he brought an army out of Newry down along the Warren Point side, and they came across at Narrowwater on a pontoon bridge. I'll be coming back to that later, because 400 years later, Lord Mountjoy did pretty much the same thing. But the Normans arrived and established themselves in Carlingford, And in a few short years, they established themselves on the whole coastal belt from Grange through Riverstown and linked up with Billurgan and Dundalk. And the rest of Cooley for the next 400 years was a sort of a wild frontier area between the Norman English forces of the Pale on one side and the Irish Gaelic chieftains of Ulster on the other. It never firmly belonged to either side. It was dominated on the Irish side by the O'Hanlons. I see a couple of them here tonight, by the way, Paddy, good man. And the O'Hanlons ruled a big chunk of South Armagh, basically the line, the southeastern corner of Armagh, and their main headquarters was in Tandragee. In fact, in the Tato Castle in Tandragee, that was the original headquarters of the O'Neills, of the O'Hanlons, sorry. And the O'Hanlons were some good boys because they managed to stay out of all the wars unless they were ridden for themselves. And particularly in the Elizabethan times, the O'Hanlons of Tandragee sort of managed not to be quite with the English and not quite with O'Neill either. They managed to switch sides, I think 8 or 9 times during the 9 Years' War, and keep themselves out of trouble. So they did not lose their land in the immediate plantation of Ulster. But I want to concentrate on O'Neill now, and I want to tell you about that cannonball that you can see in this central picture there, because that cannonball, I dug it up in my garden, still have it. It's a 4-pounder Elizabethan cannonball. That's Hugh O'Neill on the left, and that's Charles Blount, later to become Lord Mountjoy, on the right, who defeated O'Neill between 1601 1603 in particular, but defeated him at Kinsale in 1601. But we got a little bit of action here in Omeath during the 9 Years' War, specifically in November 1600. And that, I reckon, is when this cannonball and a few others like it fell off a cart somewhere in Cornamuckla and ended up in my garden. Mountjoy went through the Gap of the North and provisioned Newry in September. There was a major battle in the Gap of the North, where Myra Castle is now, in September 1600. But when Mountjoy was coming back, was leaving Newry, his scouts said that O'Neill was moving his forces across the Pass of Fathom. Now, the Pass of Fathom is what we now would call Larry Town's Loaning, which is the lane that runs out in the middle of the Flagstaff at the border bridge. So in order not to be ambushed on the steep side, on the Dromolane side, he went down the Warrenpoint side and did the King John trick of coming across on a pontoon bridge at Narrowwater. But first of all, and the annals are the accounts of the English are very clear on this, he sent the cavalry down the Dromolane side. O'Neill wasn't fit to attack his cavalry. And the cavalry seized a hill overlooking the crossing place. The hill, of course, is Cornamuckla Hill. And that's where they established their camp for 2 nights while they gathered up their forces to push on towards Carlingford. But O'Neill was waiting for them. And specifically, he was waiting at the 2 Mile Water. Now, there are many historical accounts that say the battle happened near the Esmore. Well, it didn't, I can tell you. That is not the way O'Neill did business. He wanted a nice narrow place. The English army liked to march 20 men across, if they could, with pikes. And here's a few pikemen, reenactment people. You can see the length of the pikes. And with ranks close behind each other. But on the narrow road at the 2 Mile Water, they could only manage 6 or 7 across. And that meant that with an army of 2,500 plus 800 cavalry, they were strung out all the way back to where Greer's Quay is now. And that's what O'Neill wanted. He was waiting there with trenches dug and by the 2 Mile River, which there was no bridge then. It was a ford slightly higher up on the mountainside, up in the Sleaford car park a little bit. And what he did, usual trick, the vanguard comes up, a few cavalry, pikemen, musketeers, and so on, and he lets about 200 of them cross over, and then he hits them in the flank, in the side. And according to the English side, their men ran back and forth in the trees, firing volley after volley of shots into the English army. Now, this is what their guns looked like. These are called matchlocks. It really took 2 men to fire one of these because they were often fired from a stand. And there's a burning cord which sets off the gun. But the Irish were pretty good with these, and don't be thinking Braveheart. The Irish were probably better armed with more muskets than the English army. And the English army, by the way, was about 2/3 Irish anyhow. But O'Neill didn't keep fighting. He pulled out after a couple of hours. It went on for about 3 hours. The English said they killed hundreds of Irish as usual. The Irish annals said there were about 35 or 40 English dead. But there is no doubt about it that the Irish managed to target and kill a number of senior English officers that day. And particularly, they managed to kill the secretary, Lord Mountjoy's secretary. Now, the Mountjoy had a mapmaker called Bartlett, who drew this map, the first indication we have at the time of what the area looks like. And you can see Narrowwater Castle there in the middle of it. The thing I want you to note here is that the shores of the loch are forested almost, they're shown as having forest almost all the way along, nor is there any indication of any kind of village or settlement. So when we're talking about Omeath, I'm talking about the Townlands. The question of a village or settlement comes much later, certainly not before the late 1700s. Now, this is one of the earliest maps, proper maps we have. Matthew Wren's map of Louth in 1766. There is a sort of village there, but interestingly, the only thing that's thought worthy of note besides the existence of a burial ground, no church, by the way. The penal days are still there. There would have been some sort of small mass house, but the penal days are not quite over at this point. But the one thing that is mentioned is Prospect House. And several of the map makers did tend to put the houses of notable gentlemen on their maps. So several of the earlier maps mention Prospect House. And at the left, you can see Mount Fortescue. Now that's going towards Ravensdale, and the Fortescues were the landlords over there. But it shows Narrowwater Castle, and as far as I can see, it shows the castle out in the middle of the water. Because until the railway was built to Warren Point, the stone castle at Narrowwater was in fact out on a little island. Now, the Bagenal family in the Reformation managed to seize all the lands belonging to the Cistercian Abbey in Uri and to hold on to them. The Bagenal family died out, but later the Baileys and who began calling themselves Pagets were they inherited the land through the female line, and they were the landlords of everything from Newry right round to Ballymascanlon. In fact, they owned all of Omeath on right round through Grange on the good land out there, which was of more interest to them. But who lived in Omeath? Now, there is no doubt about it. Des O'Neill, that many of you will have known, had a good theory about this. And basically he said nobody lived in Omeath really before the plantation of Ulster. So the plantation began in the early 1600s, 1610, 1611. But it was in fact after the Cromwellian Wars that the big population push into Omeath came. And according to Des, who I thought was a great man altogether, one of the things that happened was an awful lot of people came here from North Monaghan. Why? Because they landed here and they said, you have to take us in to the local people. And they said, why? They says, because we're from Omeath, Tira. We're from Holland. We're the same people as you. So we're talking 1650s. They're saying to the people here, we're the same people as you. And they're reciting a story that's 1,000 years old as to why they're related. But there is a tradition that, in fact, that they came here and the people who lived on the shore making a good living out of the fish and saying, well, that's all right. You can have land all right. You can go way up the mountain and kill the wolves and cut the trees. That's what you can do. So away you go up to Bavin and Tulla and Lisleigh and hope the wolves don't eat you. Because there were wolves. There was wolves at the Flagstaff until the 1760s. We know that there was a pack of wolves up there until that time. But this family, the Padges and the Bagenals, were the landlords, but they didn't live here. They lived in England. And the real landlords were middlemen of various kinds. So in the late 17th century, there was a man called Bickerdick who held Ballyun, and a man called O'Hanlon held the Slay, Ballinteskin, and Tulla. And Francis Hall of Narrowwater, about 1715, came in as a middleman for Cornamuckla townland. And later on, there were Brabazons, Drumgools, Murrays, Sandersons, Rosses, Townleys, and Clarks were the middlemen landlords. Now, they basically took the land from the landlord at £100 and charged our people £250. They did very, very well and extracted much bigger rents. Then in 1770, the Bailey agent John Hutchinson wrote from Greenore, his house in Greenore, to the landlord in England, asking for permission to pay £30 to the Louth Grand Jury for a road from Ravensdale, well, actually Jenkinstown, to Omeath. And it was from Jenkinstown over the Long Woman's Grave down to Omeath and to what he called down to Souter's Pub, S-O-U-T-E, or Souter's Pub, which I understand was the pub where House is now. And in 1784, the Baileys gave them permission for the first section of the new line, which was built up from Davies, the swing up from Davies as far as Cornamuckla Cross. But the road stopped there in the 1780s, and it didn't go any further, in fact, until the famine of the 1840s, when it was built on up to the Tulla Bridge, and Tulla Bridge was built in the 1840s. But in the meantime, the famine road was also coming up from Riverstown up through Glenmore. But the last section from Tulla Bridge to the Long Woman's Grave, in fact, was only built in the 1874-75. That is 100 years after the road came across from Jenkinstown. The Baileys changed their name to Paget in the late 1700s, and Henry William Paget, you see him here, put in a good show as a cavalry officer at Waterloo, and he was rewarded with the title of Earl of Anglesey. He might have been a good cavalry officer. He wasn't a very good businessman, and when he died in 1854, the government had to put his estate up for sale because of debts that were owed on it. So the whole estate all the land, as I say, well, basically from Newry right round to Riverstown was auctioned off on the 20th of November, 1857. And a new set of landlords came, mostly the middlemen who bought out from the landlord themselves. And here's the new landlords we have from 1858. Ryan in Ardahi, Ballintascan, Castle, Skill Campbell, Ballyun, and James Murphy. He's from Sugar Island and Uri. We'll be coming back to him in a while. Cornamuckla, Roger Hall from Narrowwater. Corrie Kittens from Mulla, John Owen's Woodhouse. Now, he's from a Portadown family, Owen Street in Portadown, and he begins to build his new house, what we call, later came to know as the Park Hotel. The James O'Hagan, that's there for Knocknagoran. Now, I'm not certain of this, but I understand he was by then the owner of Sutter's Pub, which later became House. But the land was not rented out in individual farms. In Omeath, and particularly in the Irish-speaking areas, people gathered together, groups of families, such as in Ardahi here, and they anything from 5 or 6 families, and in Glenmore it was as many as 30 families, would go to the landlord and say, deal with us as a group. Here's and they'd elect a headman to go and talk to the landlord. And the name they give it to the headman was Taoiseach. And Taoiseach would haggle out the rent price for different bits of land with Hall or whoever the landlord was on behalf of this whole group. And then the whole group would distribute the land among themselves. Usually there was no ditches. The land was held in little strips. There was fairly constant argument over these strips and aggravation within the group of families. And that's why Ardahi in particular got a name for this sort of argumentation and became known as Antifra Eirta, or in English, Little Hell. The other thing you can see here is that people are living in tight clusters, like those houses in Ardahi, of course, you can still see them. An even better place to see the tight cluster, this is the Roches in Lisleigh, near Sean O'Hanlon Sheds. And look at that row. There's 11 cottages there. Almost all of them are still there in ruins or as sheds, as cow sheds or something now, and bushes growing over them. And there were 11 families living there, and they were renting 55 acres in a group. Now, this group renting of land was known as Rundale. And Rundale used to extend over most of Ireland, but as far as I can see, it survived longest in 2 places, Achill Island, Tory Island as well, Achill and Tory, and here in Omeath. And funny enough, the Irish language seemed to survive longest while there was Rundale like this. Rundale was only possible because there were no cattle roamed. Remember, the fields had no ditches or walls. Rundale was only possible because the cattle were not there during the summer. The cattle were up high up in the mountain, and the people went with them, mainly the young people and the women, a few men, but the men were working down below. And they lived in these huts here, what we call boolies. They carried up rafters and re-roofed them every year with scraws. There was no windows in them. All these openings are facing to the south because the doorway was the only way that light went in there. And they went up there on the 1st of May, and they stayed there in Omeath normally too. They would come down for the pattern in the middle of August, the 10th of August or something like that. They would come down for the Omeath pattern. And Andrew, the indefatigable Andrew McGuinness, drew me this map of Tulla, which was the main bullion site for Omeath. And these are all the Irish names. And particularly if you look for the word marry, which appears, that's a local word for the boolie hunt. And there are marries all over the place. People, the sheep farmers still use the word marry for the place that because the sheep, of course, still lie in these hut sites. In the bullion ended even before the famine, or gradually died off. And there were lots of different reasons that the landlords wanted people each to hold a different farm and not be working in groups. And the landlords also started charging people more for using the mountain. But one of the reasons also was that from the late 1830s, there was free education available for everybody for the first time under the National Schools Act. So in 1841, the priest, Father Kearney, applied to the government for a grant to build a school, which is the building beside where the modern Nave Lurkin School is, the old school building. And 1843, the Church of Ireland opened up this school beside the church in Drummullah. But in fact, there had been schooling of some sort going on. There was a man called Hollywood teaching Catholic and Protestant children together for more than 30 years and receiving money from the landlord for doing it. But the landlord's agent used to complain that Hollywood had a terrible habit of disappearing during the herring season and not teaching the children right. Now, the pattern of Omeath. That woman there is Bridge Castley. Bridge na Howran, she was known, Bridge of the Songs. And Bridge was recorded in 1913 on a wax disc, a wax cylinder rather, singing a song in Irish called Pattern Uvi, the Pattern of Omeath. What was the pattern? Well, we still have a little faint relic of the pattern, but we call it the Blessing of the Graves. The original pattern was a huge festival. It was called the pattern because it was a festival of the patron saint of the area. And there were two big patterns in the area. One was Omeath and the other was Killeavy. And there was a lot of drinking and politics and all sorts of bad things that the church didn't like very much going on at these patterns. It was the annual festival for the area. It was like the other relic, I suppose, of it was like the festivities that used to take place in Omeath around the 15th of August. The church suppressed the pattern with the help of the government and often with the help of the military, and particularly the Killeavy yeomanry, breaking up events at the pattern. But there was serious trouble in Omeath in 1832 and 1833. And the military were called out to deal with it, like, you know, actual regular soldiers, not yeomen, but regular soldiers out of the barracks in Uri, because the ribbon men, the political organization which tended to be involved in shooting landlords, held marches in Omeath. These were probably ribbon men from Killian and Killeavy, but there was some sort of shooting match in 1832 on the Flagstaff Road or in Cornamuckla as Killeavy men marched down. And their leader, Thomas Taggart, was arrested for riotous assembly and did 6 months in Armagh. In 1833, they turned out even more soldiers and prevented the marchers from coming down through Cornamuckla to Omeath. They also broke up and searched tents, which were here at the mouth of the Esmore. That was where the tents were for the dancing and the drinking and so on. And they're supposed to have found weapons in the tents. In 1833, the place was swamped simply with military. There was a big campaign on at the time against paying tithes or taxes to the Church of Ireland. And as far as we can see, 1833 was the last year that the patron was held in Omeath. I'm just looking here at still no mention of a village. The Taylor and Skinner map of 1777 again points out, doesn't even mention Omeath, but points out Prospect House at 6 Irish miles out of Newry. Population-wise, 1664, the heart tax rose. There were 35 households. Now, this is why we think the big influx came in the late 1600s. And by the religious census of 1776, there were 290 households. And the 1841 education report to decide where the national schools would be placed, there were 500 families and 300 pupils available in those families for the school. Today, we reckon in the 10 townlands, there are about 400 households, just to put that in perspective. So then the next big item up is the famine. Now, there are no photographs of the famine. It's not because photography didn't exist. The picture on the left shows Queen Victoria, 1841. And photography was already 10 years old. But, you know, photography was an expensive business. You didn't bother photographing poor people. But the face of the famine is this woman on the right. And she's called Bridget O'Donnell, sorry. And that's a woman from Clare who was drawn by artists of the London Illustrated News. And this picture, this drawing, went round the world in its millions. In January, the blight appeared in mid-August 1845, and a month later it was confirmed in almost every county of the country. In 1846, the head of Carlingford Coast Guard reported that the greater part of potatoes from the previous year were in the field pits throughout the Cooley Peninsula were rotten, although considerable shipments of potatoes were still leaving Warren Point every week for England, even as the people there were starving. By April, it was estimated the new crop across Cooley was down 50%, and unemployment among the labouring population could be as high as 80%. The government was established in relief committees already. The chairman of the Dundalk Board of Guardians was Thomas Fortescue from Ravensdale. And insofar as there was ever a thing called a good landlord in Ireland, I suppose this man was qualified. As early as October 1845, Fortescue put up his own money because he couldn't get the agreement of the Board of Guardians in Dundalk, and he bought 20 tons of oatmeal to be ready to feed people. Now, there's a tradition that nobody died of hunger in Omeath. But I say we need to be very careful about that. As far as I can see, that tradition, that saying, starts with somebody collecting an item from Ardahi School in the 1930s. I'd need a bit better evidence than that. And it may be true, but it may not be very important. What we do know is that the 10 townlands, where there was a census taken in 1841 and another in 1851, and the population of the 10 townlands of Omeath had dropped by 35%. Now, they didn't die of hunger, but they were just gone. But there was massive distress, and huge numbers of people were employed building the likes of this mountain wall in Cornamuckla, or on the new line. There's the mountain wall, the famine wall in Ballyonan. But look at this. This is over in Eden Tubber, not too far away. And what is it? It was a fever house. If you got fever of any kind, you were isolated up in this house on the mountainside above Dan Phillips's house. There were basically three things. There was typhoid fever, there was relapsing fever, and there was bacillic dysentery. And these three diseases killed 80% of all the people who died in the famine. When you're suffering from malnutrition and your immune system is shot, anything can kill you. So the fact that nobody died of hunger doesn't mean nobody died. But if there was a good survival rate, it was no doubt because of access to the sea and resources to the sea. A study in the 1830s said there were 22 fully decked fishing boats employing 122 men in Carlingford Lough, and there were over 200 small open craft. Many of them were probably curraghs. And a government report from 1836 reckoned 232 Omeath people were engaged in fishing. And other reports said Omeath people travelled as much as 100 miles to sell fish. So total employment in fishing was much, much larger. But be careful here again. You've heard of the night of the big wind. It was the 6th of January, 1839. The night of the big wind destroyed at least half of all the small fishing craft in Ireland. So if you were a fisherman who lost your curragh or your small boat in 1839, would you have replaced it by 1845? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. It was, I'm sure, a very, very substantial investment at the time. Fish, the industry was huge, and we have the tradition of the young girls from Omeath carrying the fish over the mountain to market in Dundalk along the Cadger's Pad. The Cadger's Pad is marked here on the Griffith valuation map from 1857. It was such an important route that it was marked on the map, on the Ordnance Survey map. I have it in green there, coming up from Tuller Bridge. The red lines, by the way, are townland boundaries. So Tuller Bridge, zigzagging up the mountainside, and then down into Anaverna on the other side. And up there, up on the, as you get over the rise and start to go down the other side, and it gets a bit sheltered, there's Clochan na Gart. And this is a big flat rock. We still have our lunch breaks on it when we're hill walking. A big flat rock. And the tradition is that the cadgers, the girls carrying the fish in the dock, used to stop here and play cards until one day somebody dealt the ace of spades and the devil appeared out of the mist on the mountain. And that was the end of the card playing. But from 1850s, the herring were getting fairly few and far between. And here we have the last of the cadgers, Annie Flynn, 1888, photographed on the road in Anaverna. I always think it's a very touching photograph, that. So, meantime, people were leaving Omeath as the herring declined and going to work in Belfast. And they clustered around this street I've marked in the middle of here called Charlemont Street, where there were, in 1851, in the census, there were 220 Irish speakers crammed into 30 odd houses. The whole lot is now demolished and it lies under the Castle Court Shopping Centre. And these were the Fadgies. This was the Irish-speaking community of Smithfield. Lots of people who came from Omeath and spoke Irish there for about 50 years. The houses were later demolished. but you can still find typical Omeath surnames in the markets and the short strand. Why were they called Fadgies? Because there were so many of them called Paddy, and if you're speaking to somebody directly in Irish, you say a Faddy to him. Paddy, listen to me, Paddy. Ish a Faddy, you would say. So that was why they were called Fadgies. There's a wonderful book about them by Fintan de Bruyne. Now, the Gaelic tradition, power and the source of it is absolutely fantastic. Here's a story that John Bruin brought to my attention a few years ago. This is an interview with Nally Father Dooney Anloon of Cornamukla, another O'Hanlon there, Paddy, who was interviewed by Conor na Gaeilge before her death in 1909. And this is a story about three men, possibly three brothers. According to other stories, it was one of them was French, and when the Treaty of Limerick was signed, these men refused to accept the terms of surrender to William of Orange, and they sort of went on the run. And as people do who go on the run, so they ended up in Omeath. And they basically married into the O'Hanlon clan, but they were known as the Limnas. And Mara Limnach was, and that's the word for Limerick in Irish, it was, who was interviewed in 1909. And there she traces the names of 9 generations of people down from the men who came out of Limerick. And this was pointed out to me a few years ago with that Waddlers and Toddlers entrance. This is Limna's cottage. In fact, the name Limna appears on the Griffith valuation list. I understand the name has now disappeared in the area. But there you can reach out and touch a direct connection back to Limerick 1691. That's the strength of the Gaelic tradition in Omeath. So to get back to Prospect House, Captain Leonard built this about 1740, and it's still there, and it was obviously so notable that the name survived more than the village did. And Omeath the Gaeltacht, this is one of my favorite photographs. This is as you can see, a majority of people are Irish speakers in McStay, Ardahi, Bab, Tulla, and Corrickit, and Ballinteskin in 1901. In fact, the majority of people in the townlands are average, and people came from far and wide to visit the Gaeltacht here in Omeath. Why? Well, first of all, it was the only Gaeltacht in the eastern half of the country. And secondly, the population of Belfast or Dublin could be here in a couple of hours by train. So here we have in 1905, very interesting picture. Chap in the middle, there's a certain Mr. Pearce from Dublin, Patrick Pearce. And that's Willie on the left with the Homburg hat. And then far more interesting in the gossip, for the gossipers among us. On Patrick Pearce's left is Evelyn McNichol, his girlfriend. Now, you didn't know that, did you? And there they were, snaking off to a wee country hotel, I tell you. There was carry on that time too. The great and the good clustered in Omeath, and of course, the Irish College was formed here in 1912, and famously, we claim that the final version of the proclamation was signed in the dining room of what later became the hotel here, Dromullah House. There's Professor Owen McNeill, the man who called off the rising, as we called him, something like that, teaching at Dromullah House, and he was head of the volunteers in 1916. And there's them all in front of the Foresters' Hall in Knocknagowan. And here's our last Irish speaker. Now, normally we see pictures of Annie O'Hanlon, a picture with the Cardinal. But this picture was taken in 1950. I think it's a beautiful picture. Michael J. Murphy from Drummondtee, the folklore collector, took it. And there you have a woman in the full of her health and strength. And I don't know who the young lady is sitting on her knee, but perhaps in the questions and answers, somebody can let me know who that is. So, Omeath Village. Well, Omeath as a community is a creation of the plantation of Ulster and the Cromwellian Wars. Omeath, the village, is the creation of two things. The railway that came through in 1876 and the border that was established in 1921. The railway brought a Coast Guard station and a constabulary barracks, but the border brought thousands for Sunday drinking, and of course, a wee quick run up to Calvary to salve the conscience at the same, say a prayer for the mommy, salve the conscience, and then back to the pub. The railway was gone. It lasted 75 years. The border is still there, but nowadays, shall we sell them more diesel than think. So I just want to close on a personal note. I believe that Omeath's history and record as a place of refuge is still good. I think, in fact, there's a warm welcome for the stranger in Omeath, more so than in most small communities in Ireland. And I know there are jokes about blow-ins, and somebody told me you won't really be accepted here until you have 3 grannies buried in Kilcap. But the fact is, interestingly enough, in case you didn't notice, the Fadgies are back. They're all living here, buying and building houses. People with Omeath connections from Belfast, and as far as I can see, they're getting on just fine. And I think Omeath can be proud of its history and should be proud of its history. And 2 little things for people who are interested. This here is the school's collection. And this is available online at duchas.ie. There are 116 stories, I think, collected in Ardahi School by the children, writing in their jotters here in 1937 to 39. And this is a story about the last landlord, James Murphy of Sugar Island. And the story is written up by Michael Sloan, aged 14, from Bavin. And you can go in and see all those stories, perhaps your own relations. And I would love to think that the schools in particular would pick this up and run with it. There are not so many stories from Naomh Lurkin, from the school in Knocknagoran, about 45 or 50, but some of them are exceptionally good. There are ghost stories, fairy stories, and little bits of history and stuff about the night of the big wind. And finally, for those of you who are interested in following up, Google this and download it. Mapping the minor place names of the Cooley Mountains. This is a magnificent work done in 2015. And our own Andrew McGuinness from Ardahi was absolutely crucial to this. And he did a marvelous job. And I would love everybody watching here tonight that they would download this and go and read just how much that man knows about the place names and the Gaelic language up in the mountains. I'm working and hoping to involve Andrew in the making of a video about this over the next year. Okay, Rachel, I'll hand back to you, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks a million, Seamus. That was very interesting.
How are we doing in time? Oh dear, I run over again.
That's all right, Seamus, that's okay. So I suppose we'll have some questions and answers now. If anybody has any questions, you can just maybe unmute yourself there and fire away then with Seamus. Okay.
Yes.
Hey, Barry Carroll here.
Sorry, who?
Oh, sorry, Carroll, can you hear me?
Yes, Gerald. How are you?
Hey, good enough. Just a quick question. You mentioned before about, was it the Spanish cavalry or something? It was something that happened up in towards Cornamuckla. Did you mention that in another talk? Where I suppose some families hid in a wee glen from some cavalry.
Oh, yeah, it was something that there was a reference in the Ardahi school collection to, I'm getting a bad echo there. There was a reference in the Ardahi schools collection 1937 to a place up beside McStay's Wood. It's the river gorge beside McStay's Wood, the boundary between Cornamuckla and Lisleigh, where the people hid from the Welsh horses. And Andrew and I talked about this a few years back. It was fairly obvious what it was. They weren't hiding from the horses. They were hiding from a Welsh cavalry regiment known as the Ancient Britons, who came through in 1797 searching for arms, searching for pikes, and were vicious, were involved in a massacre in Ballyholland, were involved in some killings in Killeavy as well, along with the Killeavy yeomanry, and came down through Omeath, burning houses, and eventually linked up with the Ballymascanlon yeomanry somewhere about Grange. And the people were terrified, particularly, I think, the burned Ardahi. And the people hid in that glen, and then the schoolchild said that they were hiding from the Welsh horses, but it was the horse regiment. And that was 1797.
That's right. Yeah, no, I heard it before. Just just I might ask you about it again, just to see where it is about yourself and Andrew. Anyway, interesting story from the school. Thanks.
Hi, Seamus. This is Anne.
Anne.
As regards, the photograph of Mrs. O'Hanlon.
Yeah.
That young girl is her granddaughter, Sheila, who's now deceased. Sheila O'Hanlon.
All right. Lovely photograph. As I say, I think it's a much nicer photograph than some of the photographs when she was older.
Yeah.
That, by the way, is from the Durkas, as well as the schools collection, has a collection of photographs taken by our neighbour, Michael J. Murphy. And the Michael J. Murphy collection is also available at durkas.ie. I think there are maybe 20 odd photographs from the Omeath area, which are worth looking.
Seamus, that young girl, Sheila O'Hanlon, was in my class at school in the Sacred Heart in Uri.
Was she?
That's right. She went to the Sacred Heart in Uri, and then she got married. She went to live in Ballinasloe.
Right. And I always thought it such a shame that, we were in that school learning Irish, and nobody picked up the fact that one girl in our class had a grandmother who was a native speaker. It would have been such a
fluent native speaker.
It would have been such an interesting fact, and would certainly have, improved our interest in the subject. But however, so yeah, it's sad. I had heard Sheila had died. Yeah.
Anybody else there?
Can I ask? It's being recorded. Someone whom you'll know, Seamus, Marcella McBride, would have loved to have seen this, but she's in Donegal and is off the grid. And I'm just, in order to be able to tell her, is it possible to see a recording at some stage?
Rachel, can you pick up on that?
Yeah, I'm recording it here, Delia, so I should be able to sort something. So if you get on to me, Delia, and we can probably sort something like that for you.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll do that through Seamus. Yeah.
No problem.
Great. Okay, thanks.
No problem, Delia.
You were showing the photograph there of Mrs. O'Hanlon.
Yeah.
Well, have you ever heard her speaking?
Yes, I've heard the recordings.
You heard the recordings, the Punches O'Connell on the RTE archives, yeah?
Yes.
You've heard it, that's right.
I heard them. I tell you what, we heard them in 2012. We had a fairly big event here commemorating the centenary of the establishment of the Irish College.
Yes.
And her recording was played during one of those events.
Right, yeah. I attended the Irish College myself 50 years ago.
Did you?
I did.
In St. Michael's?
St. Michael's, yeah. It was, what was it, Master Deneen seemed to be...
Yes, Mihal Deneen.
Hall Deneen, that's right, yeah. That's right. Oh, well. Not the day of yesterday.
No.
No.
Hello, Seamus.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a really informative speech. Really enjoyed that. Niall Dunleavy here. I myself and my wife bought a cottage in Bavin, and as far as I can see, it dates from before 1901. I was looking at the maps, and the cottage is noted on it. But when we were building our house, we tried to preserve it, but there wasn't